Hi, everyone. My name is Juan Mandel. I'm the director of Cronkite Global Initiatives. Welcome to Cronkite, and for those of you who came from other countries, welcome to the US. Although we are located in the heart of Arizona, Cronkite is a global enterprise. Because of the advances in the media and the internet, the world is shrinking. And we have become global citizens since our lives now transcend geographic and political boundaries. This new reality means that there is a stronger interdependence among nations, increased global mobility, and opportunities for synergies. Media professionals need to have not only content knowledge, but technical skills, but they also need to be able to operate in these globalized systems and understand how meaning is constructed. Responding to that need, at Cronkite Global, we work to building bridges of understanding between media organizations, professionals, faculty, and students from all over the world. Learn more in the following video.
That's the way it is.
Hashtag Cronkite Global represents the next frontier for the nation's journalism and mass communications school.
Cronkite Global is all about figuring out how we can tell stories, solutions-oriented stories, around climate change, saving the environment, and making the planet a better place for everybody.
Cronkite Global amplifies our partnership with NBCU Academy, focused on diversifying newsrooms.
Cronkite Global means that our experts are more accessible to emerging professionals and seasoned leaders in DC, LA, and beyond.
The Global Pledge is important to me because I want to be a part of solutions-based journalism that really makes a difference.
Cronkite Global is our amazing network of
14,000 alums spread out all over the world working to dismantle misinformation.
Cronkite Global showcases that we are the only journalism and mass communication school in the country to host fellows and journalists from around the world every year.
Cronkite Global offers international experiences like covering the Olympics or studying abroad.
Bold thinking, innovation, and collaboration will lead us through this next exciting chapter. Join us. We are Cronkite Global.
All right, and now please help me welcome Frances Haugen and Enrique Acevedo to the stage. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thanks for being here today, Frances.
My pleasure.
Welcome to LA. Frances Haugen is a data scientist. She's pushing for more accountability from our social media platforms. I don't know if you catched her interview, well, one of her interviews last year on 60 Minutes when she revealed a large amount of documents that prove how this businesses operate, specifically Facebook. And since then, well, testified in Congress and has been advocating for these issues all over the world, basically. So thanks again for being here, Frances. And I think this information operations, malinformation, there's many ways to refer to this, has become one of the most important stories of the last decade, impacting everything from politics and race to public health, climate science. It seems that social media platforms have built a business model that's ripe for hyper-partisanship, for polarization, and for incentivizing the kind of hate and emotional response to content that has created so much problems. So the first thing I wanted to ask you was, and using Facebook's own research, is saying that their platform incentivizes hate speech and political division and disinformation. How do they amplify that? How does that happen?
So Facebook, when each of us think of like, what is Facebook? We usually think of, when I ask people, they say, Facebook is for seeing content from my family and friends. The reality is Facebook hasn't been that since like 2008. Over that period of time, Facebook has pushed us into more and more content that we never asked for. So that's things like your friend put a comment on something and they insert that post into your feed. You never followed the original writer of the poster of that content, or someone invited you to a group and you never joined it. But because Facebook put the content in your feed for 30 days and you clicked on something and they said, oh, you like it, we'll treat it as a follow. When those things are combined with algorithms that prioritize some content over other content, and those same algorithms rewarding extreme content over consensus building content, compassionate content, you get the perfect storm. So back in 2018, Facebook made a choice for business reasons that radically shifted our information environment. So prior to 2018, all that Facebook cared about was, could they keep you on their site longer? You know, could they maximize the time spent?
Okay.
In 2018, they came in and said, oh, interesting. If you get more likes, more comments, more reshares, you make more content. We make more money because people view more content. People view more ads.
So we make more money if you're more engaged.
If we can get more engagement in the system, if we can prioritize high engagement content, you're going to respond to all those more likes and comments and reshares by producing more content. But there was a side effect, which was all across Europe, on the left, on the right, political parties were saying, we know you changed something. It used to be we could put out the bread and butter of democracy, like a white paper on our agricultural policy, and it's not like it got the most comments. But we could see it got distribution. We could see in the stats. And now if we put out that exact same content, it's crickets. The only stuff that gets distribution now is like extreme, polarizing, divisive content.
Is that because people react to it?
Mm-hmm. The shortest path to a
more.
click. The shortest path to a click is anger.
And this is something that's being scientifically proven over and over and over again. And this is something that Facebook knows.
So we've known from independent researchers for 60 or 70 years that human brains are evolved to pay attention to threats. So we're drawn in for extreme content. We're always kind of surveying the savannah. But even Facebook has known for years that the angrier the comment thread, the more likely you are to go back to a publisher's website. So if I was a publisher and all I saw was like how much traffic was coming from Facebook, I would see the angrier stuff I write, the more traffic ends up on my website. I can make more money off that content. On Facebook's side, they could see the angrier comment thread, the more likely that content gets reshared. Right? People are drawn into extreme content.
Is that equally distributed? I mean, are we all being targeted with this disinformation or with this hate content?
So one of the things that's important for us to understand about how algorithms work is algorithms are always scanning for your vulnerabilities, and they don't show all of us the same content. So in the case of things like COVID misinformation, 80% of all the COVID misinformation only went to about 4% of the population.
Hold on, 80% of all the COVID misinformation went
in
the United States went to around 4% of the population.
Yes.
So they're feeding fuel to the fire.
Yeah, so it's one of these things where, if you think of it this way, like average person probably didn't see that much COVID misinformation. They saw some, but for the part of the population that was in that 4%, post after post after post that they saw was like their children were in danger. And it's a very rational response. If everything you're seeing is your child is in danger, wouldn't you show up and scream at a school board meeting? Wouldn't you threaten a teacher if that's all you saw?
And it actually changes the dominant narrative on who's subject to this information and why are they reacting the way they do.
Exactly.
In a way, it helps us build more empathy towards these groups, right?
I think that some people
Hopefully.
Some people blame the victim when it comes to misinformation and disinformation. They say like, oh, they're so foolish for falling for that. But the reality is, if you are in the crosshairs of the algorithm, if you're getting fed the content, advertisers have known for years, like if you say something to someone 7 times, 9 times, they begin to believe it, right? It's a very reasonable thing. Even inside of Facebook, they did studies where they exposed Facebook employees to misinformation, and even Facebook employees, it doesn't matter if you're an Ivy League graduate, you fall for misinformation.
And I think this applies perfectly to some of the misconceptions on Spanish language audiences, Latinos in the US, and the view that, well, maybe they're more prone to be victims of this information because they're not sophisticated consumers of information or not well educated. Is that accurate?
I think it's very dangerous to blame the victim when it comes to misinformation. Like I said before, if Facebook employees fall victim to misinformation, I think we probably shouldn't assume that anyone is safe. But the secondary thing is we need to remember that not everyone gets targeted with the same volume of misinformation. That people who run influence operations, people like Russia, China, other countries, sometimes even state actors, actors inside the United States, they go after populations that are valuable. Like they're looking for fault lines. They're looking for people who maybe don't have other sources of media. And in the case of Spanish language sources, if you knew that Spanish language media was underinvested in, now someone can't even check. They can't even fact check it because there's not the same access to other sources of media.
So like it happens always with these very complex situations, it's not just one thing that's making and causing this. The type of targeting that we saw of Latinos in the 2020 election with this information and that we're seeing now as we get closer to the 2022 midterms.
So part of why Latinos got targeted in 2020 is, a large chunk of Latinos are swing voters, right? They're tempted on both sides. Yep. And the nature of how modern campaigns are run is you want to find the voters that are the most likely to push over the edge. And so it's this question of not all communities get targeted with the same amount of misinformation because they're not equally electorally valuable.
And we were talking backstage about how these platforms became global and they operate globally, but they're not necessarily, at least not when it comes to the business model and profits. Yes, they have a global view of the business, right, of scale. But when it comes to safety, there's a different approach to things.
Yeah. And inside of Facebook, a huge amount of attention goes into making sure the platforms are accessible in terms of things like how good's your internet connection, how good's your phone. It doesn't matter if you're on a slow internet connection or you don't have the latest phone. They're going to figure out how to be inclusive and make sure you can use the platform. But when it comes to languages, because safety systems are expenses, there's not an equal investment in systems that aren't English. When they're trying to decide, like, should we support this language? Should we support this language? How many moderators should we have per language? They put a huge amount of investment in English because they don't want Americans to know that Facebook is a dangerous product in other countries, because we would step in and force them to spend more money on safety. When it came to things like hate speech, we have a document from 2019 where 57% of the hate speech budget was spent on English, even though about 9% of users were English speakers. But more money was getting spent on German for hate speech than on Spanish. And the only reason you would do that is because Germany was pushing for reform in Europe.
So they fear accountability.
They fear accountability.
And unfortunately, that only happens in the places where they're based, or in the places where they're actually working to hold them accountable, like in this case, Germany.
But I think there's a big opportunity, which is like Germany understands that they play a leadership role in the European Union and they can push for European Union style regulation. We could work on building a coalition of Central American, South American, Caribbean countries and saying, guess what? Spanish language speakers deserve to be just as safe as English speakers. And remember, the UK passed a law last summer. So there's only 65 million people that live in the UK. They passed a children's rights bill that said, hey, you need to do safety by design for kids. Like, kids have different needs than adults. You need to acknowledge those needs. And it was so strange. The week that law went into effect, Instagram passed a whole bunch of changes, right? Suddenly they weren't going to let you target ads at kids under the age of 16. It's like, I wonder why they did it the week the law went into effect. And so if we think about it that way, we can put together a coalition of 100 million people who are in South America and Central America, the Caribbean. And we can actually push for meaningful changes because Facebook brings up their platforms to the floor of whatever law is the bottom.
And Francis, the way we use Facebook and social media in general here in the US would suggest that we're focusing too much on Meta. We've been calling it Facebook. We focus too much on them, but it's just one alternative. It's our choice to use Facebook or anything else. I've been to places in Latin America, rural Mexico, places across Central America where Facebook is the internet. Even the phones people have access to, they don't have a data plan, but they have access to Facebook.
One of the reasons why I get up every morning, why I travel so much, is most people who live in the United States, most people who live in Europe are unaware that there are 1 billion or 1.5 billion people in the world who fall into that bucket, where Facebook is the internet. That because Facebook went into those societies and said, hey, we're going to buy the right to be the internet in your country. We're going to subsidize enough people's data. You know, if you use Facebook, your data's free. If you use anything else on the open web, you're going to have to pay for it yourself. They did that for enough people that it became disadvantageous for businesses to have their own websites, for newspapers to have their own websites. That the Facebook became the internet.
Facebook.
And the thing that I worry about is that we can look at things like the rise of TikTok in the United States and say like, oh, people are opting out of Facebook. Like, does it really matter? The kids don't use Facebook anymore. But the reality is, as long as those network effects are in place, as long as the internet equals Facebook for 1 billion or 1.5 billion people, we can't just forget about that. We can't leave it behind.
And I was referencing your interview on 60 Minutes last year, and I also remember the over 6 hours of testimony you gave in Congress. And it reminds me of the whistleblowers in industries like tobacco and pharma. And I know change happens at a glacier pace, right? It's so slow sometimes. But there was change after we saw people come forward and say tobacco companies know that smoking is bad for your health and they've been hiding this. We saw that with pharma. We've seen it with other industries. Are you seeing that type of change in after your testimony and the revelations you made public?
It's so interesting. There's a lot of people who have been so hungry for change in social media for years. These are activists, these are academics, these are researchers who've been documenting the harms for years. And when they saw the kind of tsunami of press coverage in the fall, they're like, oh, finally the reckoning has come. And a thing that can be hard is, after the wave crashes, it can seem like, did anything happen? But the reality is, these kinds of changes, that wave is just the beginning. And we've already seen some amazing steps forward. So for example, the fact that there is a bill actively being discussed in the Senate that is bipartisan on children's privacy and children's rights online, that would have been unheard of a year ago. In Europe, the Digital Services Act, so that's the first law that says the public has the right to ask independent questions and get independent answers from social media. We've never had that right before anywhere in the world. That passed for the first time a month ago, and they've been trying to pass it for 5 years. And so these are the first little glimmers of, I like to think of like a sea change. Like we're seeing a new conversation. The era of just trust us is over. And what we build off of that new platform, that's going to be a really exciting phase.
Do you think that the events of January 6th had anything to do with the needle moving a little more forward? Are people more conscious of the fact that there's also democratic backsliding happening in the U.S. and not just in places like the Western Hemisphere?
I think a lot of people were very shocked when the documents and my disclosures were released or became more known, because it became apparent that January 6th, Facebook did not meet their own duty of care for January 6th. So going into the November 2020 election, Facebook had gone and itemized, 45 things, like little tiny product changes, like settings, individual settings, where they'd say like, we keep having this problem where people will broadcast their suicides or murders on Facebook Live. Like, we cannot control this product. Maybe on election day, we shouldn't be like amplifying it to everyone and their mother. Like, instead of amplifying those scores by like 850 times, maybe we should only amplify them by like 65 times. Little changes like that. So it's not like saying ideas are good or ideas are bad. It's like, how should the products be working? On election day, Facebook said, our product in its baseline state is dangerous. We're going to turn it back a little bit. We're going to turn down the heat a little bit. Because they dissolved the part of the company that was responsible for saying, ooh, we're not in business as usual. This is a crisis. They dissolved the part of the company, civic integrity, that was supposed to be keeping us safe. They dissolved that the first week in December. And so it didn't matter that a lot of people were writing about in the press, something's about to happen. Like, for a couple weeks before January 6th, there were a number of articles about it. No one at Facebook was on deck to say, okay, we need to spin up the war room. We need to, turn the temperature down a little bit. And what's amazing is even the difference between January 6th and January 7th, at 5 p.m. Eastern time on January 6th, none of those safety measures were on. By the same time the next day, 80% of them were on. So they could have turned them on easily, but literally they were asleep at the wheel.
And I don't want to fall into a cliche, but it's scary to think that Facebook has the power to turn the volume up or down on our, rhetoric and our public dialogue.
So to be clear, like things I'm talking about there are not about picking good and bad ideas. It's things like, should you have to click on a link to reshare it? A system where you don't have to click on links before you reshare them, that's a system that runs hotter, right? Because even taking a moment to pause and like reflect and be like, do I really want to share this? That radically decreases misinformation. It's like 10 to 15%. So those little changes I was talking about are things like that. Like if a group is using a huge amount of hate speech, maybe you should prioritize like actually looking at that content sooner.
Yeah.
Right, little things like that.
And we've talked a lot about Meta, but there are also Facebook-owned companies like Instagram and WhatsApp. And WhatsApp seems to be a particularly interesting case with Latinos and people in Latin America because it's a point of connection between the two audiences, and because it's a different operation than social media, right? It's just instant messaging, encrypted chat rooms. Latinos are using WhatsApp. I was looking at the stats at a way higher rate than any other social media platform or instant messaging app. I think it was around 32 million Latinos in the US are going to use WhatsApp this year. That's half of the Latino population actively using and sharing and consuming information and content on WhatsApp. How do you regulate those, especially with concerns about user privacy?
So I am a strong advocate that end-to-end encrypted messaging is an important thing. My dominant form of social media is Signal, so I have a bunch of big group chats that are where my friends hang out. I used to work on counter-espionage at Facebook. So we were actively looking at nation-state actors who were doing things like Iran would catfish Israeli soldiers, or China would send malware to Uyghur refugees to try to compromise their phones to spy on their communities. So there's this question of like, we were about to do the transit, or we were discussing the transition of should we take Messenger to be end-to-end encrypted? So one strategy for that is to say, okay, it's all behind the encrypted veil, we can do nothing. Another is to step in and say, okay, like if we were going to think about WhatsApp as a platform, and that platform could have applications in it. So like in China, WeChat has lots of applications in it. Imagine if there was an app where, when a link came in, we said, do you want to scan this for malware? Right, we can do things that allow people to have choices. If they want to keep that container pristine and say, no, I don't want anyone looking at my files. You can say that. But coming in and saying, how could we give people better choices? How could we help them make good choices? That's a different way of approaching design. And so we shouldn't think of this as an either or, like we can either have privacy or we can have safety. We need to think about like what are the needs of people and how can we use software to meet those needs.
From what you're saying, I read that when we hold these platforms accountable and when we ask them to be mindful of how they approach these communities, it's much more productive than just asking them to take one or two steps to make the experience safer. But it's just a constant reminder that they have to address these communities with dignity, with more care, with more focus.
So imagine if we came in and said, hey, we know that because our communities are so dependent on WhatsApp, we need to actually sit down and articulate like what are the current harms that are happening. We want to co-create with you around like what would need to be done to support people on those harms. The reality is all those things are expenses. And so, right? Yeah. Like some of them might increase usage. They might make a little bit more money, but they cost money. And we need to shift the relationship with what we have with these platforms, where it shouldn't be a thing where if they do anything, we feel grateful. We're like, oh, thank you. You thought about Spanish. It should be a thing of saying, no. Like there's 1 billion Spanish speakers in the world. We need to show you we need you to show us every month what are the new things this month you did to make us safer. Right. What did you do this month to show us that you value our dignity and treat us with respect?
You were sharing some numbers on the relation between how much the platforms invest, in this case Facebook invests on policing content in English as opposed to what they do in Spanish. You talked about this in Congress too. And the difference is staggering. It's something like 9% of all users, 8 to 9% of all users are English speakers. And 80% of the resources
It's more than that. For misinformation, when you look at their operational budget, so this is things like moderators, fact checkers, the people who work in the factories who make sure the content is safe, 87% of that operational budget in 2020 was spent on English, and 13% was spent on rest of world. right?
Out of every $10 they spend on this, 1 goes to rest of the world,
Yeah.
9 stays in the U.S.
For
English-speaking
yeah.
audiences.
And for contrast, there's a thing called brand safety, which is basically like advertisers don't like their ads next to unpleasant content. Only 9% of that budget got spent on English.
Yeah. So they have to recognize that with a global audience, there's not one dominant language, and that shouldn't be the metric.
So I think it's one of these things. So there's this, we can take one look at this and say, Facebook doesn't value non-English speakers. There's another way to approach this and say, Facebook started out as a product almost exclusively for English speakers, right? It was written for Ivy League kids to hang out with each other,
kids.
right? They made bets on safety strategies and ways of thinking about safety where then they had 4 languages, then they had 10 languages, then they had 20 languages. They think about it in ways that don't really scale to a world that has thousands of languages. And it doesn't acknowledge the fact that the most fragile places in the world, often places where Facebook is the internet, are often the most linguistically diverse. So when we look at things like there was an ethnic violence incident in Ethiopia last year, that was, and the year before that was made worse by social media. Ethiopia has 120 million people. They speak something like 95 dialects. They fall into kind of 6 major language families. Facebook was only supporting 2 of those language families, and probably only a very, very tiny subset of the dialects. And so they're just not designed, like they haven't kind of broken that mold yet and said, no, we have to think about these cross-language safety systems, right? When you require someone to click on a link before you reshare it, that works in every language in the world, even if the language is only spoken by 1 million people.
And I shared with you that I've been working on a story about disinformation on Latinos for CBS News, and some of the people I've spoken with, they're like, but why are you doing this story, Enrique? Like, you in the media, you're always exaggerating things. The scale of the problem has not reached a critical mass. There's no cause and effect when you talk about erosion of democratic order or endangering public health, because disinformation is, in the universe of information, is just a tiny part of everything that people are consuming. And I look at public health, especially the issue of vaccination on Latinos in the US, or I look at other examples and I'm like, well, that certainly doesn't seem to be the case when you talk to people. What is your experience in that? Is there a real cause and effect here, or are we exaggerating things?
I do want to defend one Latinos and vaccination thing. I live in Puerto Rico, and we were the most vaccinated place in the United States. So I want to rep Puerto Rico. So like we talked about before, 4% of the population gets 80% of the vaccine, or in the United States, 4% of the population got 80% of the COVID misinformation, right? And it didn't just make them not get vaccinated. It caused them to show up and scream at school board meetings, right? In the case of the January 6th riots, QAnon, when you go and read through QAnon, it sounds crazy. But if you are in a rabbit hole that the algorithm pushed you towards, and everything you see, I'll give you a quick example on QAnon. QAnon happened because Facebook had safety limits that if they had to publish them openly, or even publish them to the government, I don't think they would have ever said, right? So instead of saying, hey, you can invite 1,000 people a day to groups across all of Facebook, they said, oh, you can invite a couple thousand people per group, but if you have 30 groups, that's cool. And so the top person who invited people to QAnon groups invited 200,000 people or 300,000 people over the course of a couple weeks, right? It's like very sensible things did not happen. And so it meant that they were able to pull people in, and the algorithm was like, oh, these groups are very, very engaged. I'll give you another example. For kids, this is kind of amazing. Go look at the recommended accounts for your child. Like at this point, I've done this, I don't know, a handful of times, under 10 times, but like more than 3. They're always the same. They're either these things called confidential accounts. So it'll be, someone will have an anonymous form, so you can submit really mean gossip or lies about another child in the school, and it gets blasted out to the whole school. Or there'll be a fight club where kids will pick anonymous fights. I learned about this from the principal of my high school. Kids can go and pick a fight with another kid, and their friend will film it, and they'll post it on the account. And he's asked Instagram to take this down over and over again. The total fraction of content that the kids in the school saw that were fights is very, very small. But for every kid who gets their arm broken because some kid picked a fight with them, or like push them down the stairs to film them, to embarrass them, or just to blackmail them. Kids are now doing things like shaming, like embarrassing kids, filming it, and then blackmailing each other. Like, those little things really tear our society apart. It makes kids scared. It makes adults scared. And like, it doesn't matter if it only impacts a few percentage points of people if you're afraid it's going to happen to you.
You use that term, tearing societies apart, and I've heard you use that term in the past. Has Meta, Facebook done anything to change that, to correct that? And how, I mean, is there any sort of independent effort to verify that?
So there are third parties that are starting to do adversarial data acquisition on Facebook. And the reason why we have to use words like adversarial is Facebook actively does not want to be studied, right? And until the Digital Services Act was passed, and it hasn't gone into effect yet, you know, it allegedly goes into effect January 1st. We'll see if Facebook complies even then. We have been reliant on people to try to pull bits of data off of Facebook because none of us actually gets to see a representative portrait of what's happening online. So when Facebook comes out and says, we have gotten better in XYZ way, until they start posting substantially more data about how their systems work, we can't trust them. And I'll give you a specific example. Back in December, they announced, we have changed how our moderation systems work. And you know, they didn't say, we heard Francis, we're gonna support more languages, but they came out and said, we're gonna support 100 languages now. And because we changed this architecture, we're gonna do 100. But they never showed us the performance of those systems. They never gave us samples and said, this is what the system believes is terrorist content. This is what it believes is not terrorist content. And that's a core problem. Like the Facebook's own document said that in the case of terrorism versus counterterrorism content, 75% of counterterrorism content was getting labeled as terrorism content and taken down. Because it's very subtle, the difference between those things. So until Facebook actually publishes data on the performance of these systems, we can't trust them. And that's the fundamental issue. Without transparency, we cannot have accountability.
I think we've painted a very comprehensive and grim picture of what's happening right now with...
I can give a pep talk at the end. I want to end on a high note.
Please. No, but
I'm used to this. It's okay.
I guess my question is, what happened? What happened to this promise of social media revolutionizing the world, bringing democracy and democratic values to every corner of the world? Like,
sure.
There was a conversation about that not too long ago. I remember covering
2010.
The Arab Spring being in places like Egypt and Libya. And this is the power of social media. And we were all so hopeful about that. Mm-hmm. What happened?
So I think the thing to remember, I am not against social media. Like, if we had social media that was like what we had in 2008, so that social media that was about our family and our friends, I would not be sitting before you today. Facebook has run experiments where all they do is give you more content you consented to and less content you did not consent to, and for free you get less hate speech, less violence, less nudity. Because the problem is not your friends and it's not your family. It's that Facebook pushed you into groups that you never wanted to join, that had millions and millions of people, and then only gave you a tiny sliver of the content of those groups that was biased towards the most extreme content. So, you know, back in 2010, we had something that was much closer to something that was about our family and friends. But Facebook had to make more money every single quarter. They had to keep us on there more every single quarter. I always like to joke, the problem with Facebook is that your family and friends let Facebook down, right? That there used to be, this is how much content you viewed on Facebook in 2008, and every quarter they needed you to look at a little bit more, and your family and friends didn't keep producing more and more, so they had to figure out other sources of it. And you know, I really believe that there will probably be something that's like a Web3 social media, Facebook-like site that's going to come along that's going to be owned by its users.
Decentralized?
Yeah, it'll probably be decentralized. And because it'll be owned by its users, if we had all gotten to vote in 2008, I don't think we would have ever gotten to where we are today. But because Facebook, and particularly Mark Zuckerberg, because he has all the votes, he has all the shares, all the vote shares, we've been living in Mark's world instead of in our world. And you know, one day I think we're going to have something that's closer to what we had before.
And that's what I want to focus the last part of our conversation on what's ahead and solutions too, hopefully to leave people on an optimistic note. One example of action, I think it's interesting, is what's happening with one of our co-hosts today with X. They just announced that they raised $80 million to create the Latino Media Network.
Ooh, exciting.
Yeah, I think that's something
Always
very
invest in high quality media.
and Latinas, women who were able to raise this money, this capital to buy a radio station group, and just to create content for Latinos in the U.S. I guess my question is that a way to combat disinformation targeted at a particular segment of the population? Just ownership, more diverse ownership, where decisions are not being taken in a room where people are not represented.
I do think it's important. Like one of the things I always recommend is that people try to subscribe to at least one source of media that you really trust. It's one of these things where we really have to put our dollars where our values are. And we need to have media that follows our communities, that reflects our communities. And so I'm really glad that they're investing more in Spanish language media. The secondary thing is, together we are wiser than we are alone. So a huge part of influence operations is about preying on our vulnerabilities. A lot of the dangers on these algorithms are about our specific vulnerabilities to rabbit holes. I have a number of group chats where we digest the news. So my favorite one is called Doom News. It's very descriptive. It's mostly about war. Sometimes it's about famine, happy topics. But it means that I don't sit and see something on the Ukraine conflict and evaluate it by myself. We talk about it. We say, does this sound plausible? And this is how communities have traditionally processed information. And one of the things that I really worry about some of the trends happening in society is that we erode more and more of our infrastructure for connecting in person. Fewer people go to church. We don't have bowling leagues. Interacting in person is expensive. We don't pay for community centers. And if we can't have real life community that helps us process that information, at a minimum, have a group chat that helps you sift through the information you see about the world. Because it is complicated. It's going to get more complicated with time.
And I only brought up my phone because you also have a very unique tweeting system where your mom edits your tweets.
Well, she writes. My mom writes.
The latest one
is
that's
okay.
What about
very good.
We turn to social media for connection and understanding? We have that. We can have that again. It won't happen by accident. We need to design our systems to amplify and favor real connection.
Yes.
Your mom edited this?
She edited that.
Do you mind if I use your mom for my tweets as well?
Sure, yeah. Well, she's great.
I think she's pretty genius.
So the thing, if I can have a moment to give an optimistic end note.
Please.
Okay. So the thing that I really believe we all need to study history more, because history is not just about preventing mistakes. It also is meant to give us a grounding. It's meant to remind us that things can be bad now, and guess what? We've done this before. Right? Every single time we've invented a new form of media, it's been super disruptive. The printing press, not actually that disruptive because no one could read. So it took something like 60 or 70 years before Martin Luther came along and was like, 3% of Germans can read. That's unacceptable. Everyone must learn to read the Bible. We're going to even teach women to read. That's how much we need to teach people to read. And unfortunately, it also unleashed the first era of misinformation. You had people writing pamphlets on how your neighbors were witches and you should burn them, right? How do you evaluate if your neighbor's a witch? Six ways to tell.
Like right now.
Right now, yeah. When it came to cheap printing presses, newspapers, we literally fought wars, right? Hundreds of thousands of people died over misinformation. And we came back and said, we're going to develop journalistic ethics. We're going to develop journalism schools. We're going to have transparency rules on media ownership. Same thing with radio and cinema. Dictators rose to power and drove World War II based on being extremely good at radio, extremely good at cinema. TV, same kind of thing. This happens over and over again, and it feels overwhelming right now because it is our burden to deal with. You feel overwhelmed right now because this is our time to shine, and we're going to do this. But until we wrestle with it, until we push for something that actually works, it's going to feel a little chaotic because we are in that unknown zone. But we've done it before, and we're going to do it again. So I have faith in you because we can do this. Yeah.
I couldn't find a better way to end our conversation. Thank you so much, Frances. And thank you so much for putting up with me for the past 2 hours because I've been asking you all these questions. Thank you, everyone. We'll take a little break and we'll be right back.